17 names. That's what the beachcomber found carved into a massive piece of driftwood near Bowman Bay on a frozen morning in January of last year. At first, she thought nothing of it. Tourists carve initials into logs all the time. Declarations of love, inside jokes. The usual beach graffiti that time and tide eventually erase. But these weren't fresh carvings. The wood was ancient, blackened by decades, maybe generations, submerged in salt water. Marine biologists who later examined it estimated it had been underwater for at least 30 years, possibly longer. The grain was compressed, saturated, transformed by pressure and time into something more stone than timber. Yet the names carved into its surface were still legible, not faint, not barely visible. Deep, precise, as if someone had pressed them into the wood with impossible force, burning them into existence. Sarah Chen, the woman who found it, almost walked past. Something made her stop. She ran her fingers across those 17 names and felt a cold recognition she couldn't explain, like touching a gravestone for someone you've never met, but somehow already mourned. When she posted a photo to a local history forum, a retired park ranger named Patricia Morse saw it and felt her blood turn to ice water. She recognized 4 of the names immediately, then 6, then all 17. Every single name belonged to someone who had vanished at Deception Pass. Not dead, not drowned with bodies later recovered. Vanished. Disappeared without a trace between 1959 and 1995. People who walked toward the water and simply ceased to exist, leaving behind no remains, no evidence, no explanation beyond the holes they left in their families' lives. But here's what made Patricia Morse's hands shake as she stared at that photograph. Some of those names were never released to the public. Some were buried in archived reports that were never digitized, never shared, never discussed outside internal Park Service memos from decades ago, reports she herself had filed and then been told to forget about. So how did those names end up carved into a piece of driftwood that had been underwater since before some of those people even disappeared? Who carved them? When and why? The oceanographers couldn't explain it. The wood predated several of the disappearances. The park historians couldn't explain it. There was no record of anyone attempting such a memorial. And Patricia Morse, who had spent 17 years watching people vanish into those waters, couldn't explain the one detail that haunted her most. The names weren't listed chronologically. They weren't alphabetical. They were arranged in a pattern that took her 3 sleepless nights to recognize. They were listed in the exact order people would disappear, including 2 names at the bottom that didn't match anyone in the records yet. 2 names are still waiting to be claimed. And 6 weeks ago, the first of those 2 names was checked off the list when a woman named Alexandra Winters walked into the water below Deception Pass Bridge and never walked back out. Which means there's 1 name left. 1 more person the water is expecting. 1 more disappearance already carved in wood that spent decades beneath waves, waiting to surface, waiting to be found, waiting to prove that whatever happens at Deception Pass isn't random at all. It's been planned. For a very long time, let me take you to Deception Pass, because if you've never stood on that bridge and looked down into those waters, you need to understand what we're dealing with. The pass itself is a knife wound in the earth, a narrow channel that separates Whidbey Island from Fidalgo Island in Washington State, about 90 miles north of Seattle. The bridge spanning it has become iconic, its steel arch rising 180 feet above water, that churns with a violence that seems almost sentient. During tide changes, the current can reach 9 knots, creating whirlpools that could swallow a car, standing waves that have capsized boats, and a roar that drowns out normal conversation. Captain George Vancouver encountered this place in 1792 during his expedition to chart the Pacific Northwest. A naval officer trained to observe and document with precision. He was so thoroughly misled by what he saw that he did something unusual for a man of his temperament. He named a geographical feature based on his emotional reaction to it. Deception Pass, he wrote in his log, because what had appeared from a distance to be a small, easily navigable inlet revealed itself to be something far more dangerous. A deep, turbulent strait with currents that defied prediction, and waters that seemed to pull vessels toward their doom with deliberate intent. But Vancouver was wrong about one thing. The deception didn't begin when he arrived. It had been there for thousands of years, long before European ships ever touched these waters. The indigenous peoples of this region, the Samish and Swinomish nations, knew the pass by another name, Istujjiluchiwi, and they knew better than to trust it. Their oral traditions, passed down through generations, speak of the pass as a threshold place. Not just water flowing between 2 islands, but a boundary between worlds. They told stories of warriors who paddled across in the morning mist and never reached the other shore. Their canoes would be found hours later, floating empty, paddles still dry, as if the men had simply stepped out onto invisible ground. The elders warned their people. There are times when the pass opens, times when the barrier between what we see and what exists beyond grows thin enough to slip through, times when something beneath the water becomes visible to those who aren't meant to see it yet. And the most well-known of these stories centers on a young woman named Kokwal Alwut. Now, if you visit Deception Pass State Park today, you'll find her story memorialized in a beautiful carved pole at Rosario Beach. The park rangers will tell you the romantic version. Kokwal Alwut was a Samish maiden of extraordinary beauty who caught the attention of a supernatural being who dwelled beneath the waves. He courted her from his underwater kingdom, and eventually, moved by love and by his promise that her people would always be provided for, she agreed to join him. She descended into the water and became a guardian spirit. Her long hair transformed into kelp that still sways in the current, watching over those who pass above. It's a lovely story. Tourists take photos of the story pole. Families read the plaques. Everyone leaves with a sense of cultural appreciation and maybe buys a postcard in the gift shop. But Patricia Morse, the ranger who worked at that park for 17 years, told me something different before she moved away from the coast entirely. She told me that there's another version of the Kokwal Alwut story, one that the park service doesn't share with visitors, one that the elders only speak about in private, and only to those they trust to understand the difference between myth and warning. In this version, Kokwal Alwut didn't choose to go beneath the waves. She was called night after night. She began hearing a voice from the water. It knew her name. It knew her fears, her hopes, her secret thoughts that she'd never spoken aloud. It sang to her in a language that predated words, a sound that bypassed her ears and spoke directly to something deeper, something that existed before she was born and would exist after she died. The voice promised her truth. It promised her understanding. It promised her a place where she would finally fully belong. And one morning, before dawn, While her family slept, Kirkwalalwut walked to the water's edge. Witnesses said she moved like someone in a dream, her eyes open but seeing something no one else could perceive. She walked into the churning current as if it were calm as glass, and the water accepted her without struggle, without sound. She was gone, but she didn't die. That's the crucial part of the story that gets lost in translation. She didn't drown. She transformed. She became something else. Something that exists in the boundary place where water meets air, where the human world touches something older and stranger. And according to the version that doesn't make it into the tourist materials, Kirkwalalwut is still down there, still calling, still singing in that language before words, still hungry. Thomas Paul, a Swinomish elder who passed away in 2001, spent his final years trying to warn people about Deception Pass. Marcus Bennett, a local historian, spent months interviewing him in the late 1990s, and those recordings, kept private until recently, reveal a man deeply troubled by what he'd witnessed. White people think thin places means spiritual, Paul said in one recording. Beautiful, mystical. They want to go there, have an experience, take a photo. They don't understand. Thin places are dangerous. When the boundary wears thin, things pass through both ways. What's here can go there. What's there can come here. And some things that pass through don't pass all the way. They get stuck halfway, trapped between worlds. Those are the worst ones. The ones that are neither alive nor dead, neither human nor other. They're conscious enough to suffer, conscious enough to want, and they call out to those who might hear them, trying to pull someone else through to keep them company in that nowhere place. Marcus asked him directly, "Is that what's happening at Deception Pass?" There was a long silence on the recording. Then, "It's been happening since before my grandfather's grandfather was born. It'll keep happening after your grandchildren are dust. We built our villages near the pass, but never at the pass. We fished the waters, but never alone, and never at dawn or dusk when the light plays tricks. We taught our children that if they heard their name called from the water, they must never, under any circumstances, acknowledge it. Because once you answer, once you recognize that you've been seen by what's down there, it knows you, and it will never stop calling." When Marcus pressed him what exactly is down there, Thomas Paul's answer was frustratingly vague. Something that remembers when the world was different, when the ocean was young, and the rules that govern life and death weren't yet fixed. Something that existed before those rules, and doesn't have to follow them. It's not evil, it's just other. And it wants what all lonely things want. Company, understanding, someone to share the weight of remembering everything the world has forgotten. 3 months after that interview, Thomas Paul was found dead in his home of natural causes. He was 84 years old. But Marcus Bennett told me that when he went to pay his respects, Paul's daughter pulled him aside and told him something her father had said the day before he died. "He told me he'd been having dreams," she said. Dreams of people he'd known who'd disappeared years ago. They were all together beneath the water, living in a city he didn't have words to describe. And they were happy. That's what scared him most. They weren't suffering. They weren't crying for help. They were content, like they'd found something they'd been searching for their whole lives without knowing they were searching. And he said they'd invited him to join them. In his dream, he'd almost said yes. Thomas Paul died peacefully in his sleep the next night. But his daughter told Marcus one more thing that she's never repeated publicly. Her father's lips were dry and cracked when they found him. as if he'd been breathing salt air for days, and his hair, which had been pure white for 20 years, had darkened near the roots to the colour of kelp. The modern documented history of unexplained disappearances at Deception Pass begins on September 14th, 1959, with a man named Donald Weston. Donald was 42 years old, a Boeing engineer with a reputation for precision and methodical thinking. He wasn't the type to take unnecessary risks or act impulsively. His co-workers described him as the kind of man who triple-checked his calculations, who always had a backup plan, who wore suspenders and a belt, because why trust just one? On that September morning, a Saturday crystal clear with visibility for miles, Donald and his wife Helen drove up from Seattle to photograph the Deception Pass Bridge. It had recently been repainted, its steel frame a fresh rust red against the blue sky, and Donald wanted to capture it for a series of Pacific Northwest engineering landmarks he was documenting. Helen waited in their Chevrolet Bel Air, reading a magazine, while Donald walked down toward the water with his camera. She could see him from where she sat. That's important to understand. She had a clear line of sight. She watched him pick his way carefully across the rocks, moving with the cautious deliberation of a middle-aged man in dress shoes navigating uneven terrain. He found his spot. He raised his camera to his eye. He took a step backward to frame the shot, and then he was gone. Not fell, not slipped, gone. Helen's first thought was that he'd stumbled, maybe twisted an ankle in a gap between rocks. She got out of the car, calling his name. Irritated at first, Donald was supposed to be careful. He'd promised her this wouldn't take long. But as she reached the rocks where he'd been standing, irritation transformed into confusion, then into the first cold fingers of real fear. His camera was still there. The leather strap was still warm from his neck, the metal still holding his body heat. But Donald was gone. The water below was violent. The tide was changing, current ripping through the pass with enough force to strip bark off floating logs. But Helen hadn't heard a splash, hadn't heard him cry out. In the time it took her to walk 50 feet from the car to the rocks, maybe 30 seconds, her husband had been there and then not there, as if he'd stepped through a door only he could see. The Coast Guard searched for 3 days. Divers went down in the brief windows of slack tide when the current calmed enough to allow it. They found nothing, nobody, no clothing, no sign that Donald Weston had ever existed beyond that camera lying on sun-warm rock. But the camera held something. When the film was developed weeks later, it contained the last photograph Donald Weston ever took. The bridge, perfectly centered, dramatically lit, the kind of composition that would have pleased him. Everything in focus. Everything is deliberate, everything except the lower right corner. There, barely visible, rising from the churning water, was what appeared to be a hand. A human hand, reaching upward, fingers slightly spread as if beckoning, or perhaps warning. The photograph was examined by experts from Boeing, Donald's co-workers who knew him, who knew his precision, who insisted he never made mistakes. They concluded that the hand-like shape was probably seafoam caught at an unusual angle, a trick of light and water that happened to form a pattern. Our pattern-seeking brains interpreted as human. Probably. But Helen Weston never believed that. Before she died in 1987, she gave an interview to a local newspaper, where she said something that didn't make it into the published article. The reporter kept the full transcript though, and I've read it. "I saw the photograph before the experts got hold of it," Helen said. before they started talking about foam and tricks of light, and I'm telling you, that was a hand, a human hand. And it wasn't warning Donald away, it was pulling him in. I could see the tension in the fingers, the way they were curved. That was the hand of someone pulling something toward them with great effort, with hunger. And here's what keeps me awake at night, even now, 28 years later. I think Donald saw that hand before he took the picture. I think he saw it, and he wanted to photograph it to prove what he was seeing was real. And the moment he acknowledged it, the moment he pointed that camera and clicked the shutter, it knew he'd seen it. And it took him. Helen Weston never returned to Deception Pass. She sold the camera. She moved to California, and she never went near the ocean again. Donald Weston was the first of the 17 names carved in that driftwood. Patricia Morse didn't plan to tell me the truth. When I first contacted her at her home in Cedro Woolley, where she'd retired after leaving the park service, she was polite but guarded. She'd give me the official line, "Deception Pass is dangerous. People need to respect the currents. Tragedies happen when safety protocols aren't followed." But I asked her about the Type 7 incidents, a code that appeared in internal park service memos from the 1980s and 90s that had been partially released through a Freedom of Information Act request. Type 7 was listed in budget reports and staff meeting notes, but never defined in any document I could find. When I mentioned it, Patricia went very quiet on the phone. Then she said, "How do you know about Type 7? I told her I'd spent 6 months combing through archived documents, cross-referencing incident reports with Ranger shift logs, looking for patterns." Another long silence. Then, "Come to my house. Don't bring a recording device. I'll talk to you, but only once, and only if you promise you won't use my name while I'm still alive." Patricia Morse is 68 now. Her living room is filled with photographs from her ranger days, groups of smiling co-workers, sunset shots of the bridge, families she'd helped when their kids got lost on the trails, the pictures of someone who loved her job and was proud of her service. But there's not a single photograph of the water below the bridge, not one image of the pass itself. Type 7, she told me, settling into her armchair with coffee neither of us would drink, was the code we used when someone reported hearing voices from the water. It happened often enough that we needed a way to track it without alarming the public or making it seem like we had a situation. She explained that it usually started the same way. A hiker, almost always hiking alone, would come to the visitor center or approach a ranger on the trail. They'd look confused, sometimes frightened, sometimes oddly calm, and they'd say they heard someone calling their name from down in the past, not shouting, not yelling for help, just calling. The way a friend might call to you from another room, the way someone who knows you might say your name to get your attention. We had a protocol, Patricia continued. We'd ask them questions. Did they recognize the voice? Had they been drinking? Were they on any medications? Did they have a history of auditory hallucinations? We were trying to sort out who was having a genuine medical or psychological crisis from who was experiencing the other thing. What was the other thing? I asked. The call, she said simply. That's what we called it among ourselves when we were off duty and a few beers deep and could finally talk about the things we weren't supposed to acknowledge. The call. Some people heard it and shook it off, rationalized it as wind through rock formations or the echo of other hikers. But others couldn't shake it. It got into them. Within hours or days, they'd be back. We'd see them on the trails, moving toward the water, and we'd try to intercede, try to redirect them. but it was like trying to wake someone who's sleepwalking. They'd look right through you. Patricia set down her coffee cup with shaking hands. In my 17 years at that park, I personally witnessed 4 people walk into the water, not jump from the bridge. That's different. That's its own tragedy. I mean, walk into the churning current from the shore. Walk in like they were walking through a door they could see, and we couldn't. And all 4 of them had the same expression. Not fear, not despair. Something like recognition. Like they were seeing someone they'd been waiting their whole life to meet. I asked her to tell me about the worst one, the one that made her realize this was beyond natural explanation. She closed her eyes, and when she spoke, her voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. Jennifer Huang, October 1989. Graduate student from the University of Washington, 26 years old, studying intertidal ecosystems. She'd been camping at the park for 3 days, and on her last morning, campers reported seeing her walk toward the bridge before dawn, moving slowly, deliberately, like she knew exactly where she was going. A jogger found her standing on the rocks below the bridge at 6:47 a.m. He was maybe 30 yards away when he saw her. He said she was just standing there, completely still, staring at the water. He called out to her. The rocks were slippery with algae, and he was worried she might fall. She turned to look at him, smiled, and said clear as day, "They're singing such beautiful songs." Then she stepped backward into the water. The jogger ran to the edge. He was there within seconds, but Jennifer was already gone. And here's the thing that doesn't make sense. The tide was at slack, the calmest it ever gets at Deception Pass. The current was barely moving. She should have surfaced. She should have been visible, but she wasn't. She went under and never came back up, even though the water couldn't have pulled her away yet. Patricia opened her eyes and looked at me directly. I was one of the rangers who responded. I was there within 20 minutes. We had divers in the water within an hour. They found nothing. Not her body, not her clothes, not a single trace. But they found something else that wasn't in the official report. One of the divers, a guy named Tom Chen, who'd been diving those waters for 15 years, came up early, refused to go back down, said he'd seen something on the rocks about 40 feet below the surface. Markings. Fresh markings, he said, like someone had been scratching the stone recently. We asked him what they looked like. He said they looked like writing, but not in any alphabet he recognized. Just symbols arranged in lines, like sentences or maybe warnings. Tom Chen never dove Deception Pass again. When I talked to him years later, after we'd both left the park service, he told me he'd had the same dream every night for months after that dive. In the dream, he was underwater, and Jennifer Huang was there with him. She wasn't dead. She was alive, breathing water like it was air, and she was carving those symbols into the rock. And when he asked her what they meant, she looked at him with eyes that were completely black and said, "Instructions for the ones who come next." When you lay out all 17 documented cases of unexplained disappearances at Deception Pass between 1959 and 1995, patterns emerge that are impossible to ignore. First, the timing. These disappearances cluster around specific conditions, dawn or dusk, during spring tides when the current is at its most extreme, and overwhelmingly in November and March. These are the months when fog is most common, when the bridge seems to float suspended in grey nothingness, when the boundary between sky and water blurs into uncertainty. Second, the behavior preceding disappearance. In every single case where there were witnesses, they described the missing person as acting strangely in the hours or even days before they vanished, standing motionless, staring at the water, talking to themselves or to someone who wasn't there, moving in what multiple witnesses independently described as a dreamlike or sleepwalking manner. Third, and most disturbing, the instantaneous nature of the disappearances. These weren't people who fell and were swept away by the current. These were people who were there, and then not there in the span of a heartbeat. No struggle, no cry, no splash, just a person standing in one moment and absent in the next, as if they'd blinked out of existence. Fourth, no bodies, ever. The currents at Deception Pass are powerful but predictable. Bodies of drowning victims, and there have been many tragic documented drowning deaths at the pass over the years, typically follow established patterns. They wash up on the beaches of Whidbey Island or get caught in the kelp beds near Bowman Bay. Search and rescue teams know where to look. They know how water and tide move a body. But these 17 people, they simply vanished. No remains recovered, no belongings found beyond what they'd left on shore. It's as if they'd been erased from the physical world, leaving behind only the holes where they used to be. Michael Pritchard's case in March 1993 is particularly haunting because it was witnessed by his 13-year-old grandson, Ryan, who is now in his 40s and still traumatized by what he saw. I met Ryan at a coffee shop in Portland. He agreed to talk to me only because he said he needed someone else to know what he'd seen. He needed it documented, put into words, made real through testimony, because part of him still didn't believe his own memory. We went to Deception Pass to fish, Ryan told me, hands wrapped around a coffee mug he never drank from. Grandpa loved those waters and had been fishing there since he was my age. He knew every rock, every current shift, every hiding spot where the fish gathered. He was teaching me, showing me how to tie the knots he'd learned from his father. The same knots his father had learned from his father. Generations of knowledge, you know, handed down. Ryan stared out the coffee shop window. We'd been there maybe 20 minutes. He was behind me, guiding my hands through the knot, under, around, through, and mid-sentence, he just stopped. I turned around, and he was staring at the water with this expression I'd never seen before, like he'd seen a ghost, but not a scary ghost. Someone he loved. He said a name. Marie. That was my grandmother. She'd been dead for 5 years. Cancer. I said, Grandpa. And he smiled at me, but he wasn't really seeing me anymore. He was looking past me at the water, and he said, She's here. She's been waiting for me. Then he took off his jacket. I folded it. Neat, careful, the way he did everything. Set it on the rocks. Took off his watch, set it on top of the jacket, and he walked into the water. Ryan's voice broke. The current there, I'd watched it all morning. It was insane, ripping through at maybe 6, 7 knots, creating whirlpools that swallowed whole logs. But when Grandpa walked in, it was like the water just opened for him, like it wasn't there. He walked into surf that should have knocked him over immediately. Water that should have swept him off his feet and battered him against rocks. And he just kept walking, steady, calm, like he was walking down a hallway in his house. I was screaming, running after him. I got to the edge and the current nearly ripped me off the rocks. But Grandpa was already waist deep, chest deep, and the water wasn't touching him the way it should have. It was moving around him, like he wasn't subject to the same physics as everything else. And then he turned and looked back at me one last time. He was smiling, really genuinely happy in a way I hadn't seen since Grandma died. And he waved, just a little wave, like he was saying goodbye before getting on a plane for a trip. Then he went under, smooth, controlled, like he was diving into a swimming pool, and he never came back up. Ryan was silent for a long time. They searched for 3 days. They told me the current had taken him, that his body would surface eventually, that I shouldn't blame myself for not being able to stop him. But they never found him, and they never explained how he walked through that current like it wasn't there. They never explained why he looked so happy. Ryan met my eyes. I've spent 30 years trying to convince myself that I misremembered it. That shock distorted what I saw. That maybe the current wasn't as bad as I thought. Maybe the angle was wrong. Maybe. But I know what I saw. My grandfather walked into water that should have killed him. And instead of drowning, he just left. He went somewhere else. And whatever was waiting for him there, he wanted to go. He chose it.